why do you think they're not more careful in drawing a line between what's legal and acceptable, at least legally, and what's illegal and sadistic and criminal? Is there something about, okay, so here's part of the reason I'm asking this question. So I spent a lot of time studying the perceptions and actions of very, very pathological people. And one of the things that is interesting about serial sexual killers, for example, is that their behavior tends to accelerate across time. And there's a very specific reason for this. So sex has an intrinsically rewarding nature, but that the nature of anything that's rewarding can be heightened by novelty. So because novelty itself, if it's in the right dose, is also gives you a dopaminergic kick. Sexual anticipation and sexual pleasure produce a dopaminergic kick, but novelty heightens that. Okay, so what that tends to mean, especially if you're overdoing it, let's say, is that you want to stay on the novelty edge, right? So what you see with serial killers, for example, who have a sexually sadistic twist is that the sadistic element in their crime accelerates across time as they search for that edge to stay where things are maximally gratifying. And so there's reasonable evidence that the same thing applies to pornography use online, is that maybe it starts out with relatively vanilla displays, but then it progresses to more and more graphic displays, and then past graphic, there's kinky, and past kinky, there's violent, and past violent, there's violent and kinky, and that's not as far as it goes. And so you can also see this culturally. You know, Theodore Dalrymple, who's a very interesting British essayist, made a lot of this when he was talking about how porn invaded our culture, that the borders were, what would you say, moved bit by bit, really starting in the 1920s. He identified a famous case. Who was the novelist? Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned as a pornographic novel in Great Britain, and it was quite sexually graphic, especially for the time. And that ban was overthrown, and he thought of that as although Dalrymple is a free speech advocate, he thought of that, the victory of, I can't remember who the author was, actually quite a renowned author, the victory for his novel as the entry point of the pornographication of the culture. Okay, but over the course of my life, I've seen in our culture the same thing that happens to people who become increasingly sexually perverse as they chase the novelty edge. Because when I was very young, let's say, it was Playboy that broke the barrier fundamentally, right? That was Hugh Hefner, and Playboy was a relatively sophisticated magazine for a porn magazine. Most of the images of women were nudes, but not sexually explicit nudes, merely nudes. And there was a lot of journalism in Playboy and some very good writing. And Hefner kind of marketed that as bohemian 1950s, freedom and equality between men and women, the cool single person who was willing to explore their sexuality in a creative manner. And that was Playboy. And of course, that empire lasted for quite a long time. But then after Playboy came Penthouse, and Penthouse was much more sexually graphic, a lot more explicit. And after Penthouse came Hustler, and Hustler started to move into you might call it into the domain of severely bad taste. And that was certainly the case. And then, by the time, then Hustler metamorphosed into, dozens and dozens of magazines that concentrated on every fetish you could possibly imagine. And then the internet came along, and it was the case that the expansion of the internet was actually facilitated in a major way by the desire of isolated and socially incompetent men to share sexually graphic images. I mean, the whole internet was driven at, we know what, 1/3 to 40% of the traffic on the internet is pornographic still. And so it was an incredible, the sexual element was an incredible motivating factor for the development of the World Wide Net. And there's a lot of criminal activity on the net, maybe 50% of it, right? And it's very hard to hold people accountable. So what we're seeing is our whole culture chasing that novelty edge, and that's all driven by, in the worst cases, narcissistic, psychopathic, Machiavellian, sadistic criminals, and we can't hold them accountable. It's really bad. It's really bad. Okay, so now...
But we can hold those who are distributing it accountable.
Well, okay, can we?
Yes, we absolutely can.
Who are these people?
Well, first I want to kind of just, basically acknowledge what you just said is absolutely true, is that today on these free porn tube sites, again, free, you just, there wasn't even an Are You 18 click-through button at the beginning of 2020 where any 7-year-old could just click right through, end up on the homepage of Pornhub or X videos for free. And what they're seeing on the homepage is not your father's Playboy, right? It's not the images that you were describing. It is, there was a study done that was published in the British Journal of Criminology, and they analyzed the homepages of these sites. And when you get onto Pornhub, there's about 50 videos that you will see that if you scroll over, they autoplay. And these are these homemade user-generated videos, and they found that 1 in 8 of those videos was displaying sexual violence, videos that would include non-consent, incest. And I think that is just so alarming that is the reality that we're living in today.
America's healthcare system is lacking in any real care. Insurance companies regularly deny progressive treatment options, primary care physicians refuse to order comprehensive lab work, and the standards of care lag years behind the leading research. That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick Health represents a paradigm shift in how we approach medicine. The premier health optimization platform, Merrick Health empowers you to maximize your longevity and performance with the confidence that comes from having experts in your back pocket. They offer cutting-edge diagnostic labs, concierge health coaching, and expert clinical oversight. They help you achieve your health and fitness goals by leveraging data-driven lifestyle and nutrition recommendations, along with supplement and prescription treatment options. If you're listening to this show, then you're probably a proponent of taking your health into your own hands. That's why we've teamed up with Merrick Health to offer a turnkey optimization package designed for those who want to maximize their performance and longevity with the most elaborate testing on the market. You'll receive extensive lab work, thorough lab reports, video calls with Merrick's health experts, and expedited onboarding. Go to merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson to get the same panel and medical oversight I get and save 10% at checkout. That's merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson at checkout.
Well, exposure also desensitizes, right? So if you're a therapist and you want to reduce the anxiety that someone feels, well, I can give you an example. I had a client one time who was a vegetarian, and but this person was a vegetarian because they were really terrified of life and of death and couldn't go into a grocery store. And so because of the displays of meat, and one of the things that I did was bring them to a store that was closer and closer to an actual butcher store and have them look, because that's what you do. You have people look at what it is that they're terrified of. And if they do that voluntarily, their anxiety levels decrease. Actually, they become braver, but fundamentally, you could say as well that their anxiety levels decrease. And so the revulsion that young people would feel for violent acts is, especially on the sexual side, is going to be reduced as a consequence of that kind of voluntary exposure. And God only knows what that does. I mean, I can't imagine. And it's an unbelievably powerful force too. We're in a situation now where a 13-year-old boy, because it's going to be boys, mostly men using these sites because men are much more sensitive to visual stimuli. Women seem to prefer literary pornography.
Although there are many, it's increasing, the number of girls.
Do you know what the proportion is by any chance?
No, I don't know that exact proportion. I do know it's still boys primarily that are primarily being exposed, but girls as well are consuming. this kind of content at very young ages as well.
Yeah, well, curiosity is going to drive that to some degree. Right? There's a great book by the Google engineers called A Billion Wicked Thoughts. Do you know that book?
No, I don't.
Oh, that's I think the best book I've ever read, investigating the use of the sex difference, for example, and the use of pornography. It's a very smart book. And so, we're in a situation right now where the typical 13-year-old boy can see more beautiful nude woman than any man ever saw in history, right? Incredibly powerful, possibly irresistible stimulus package. And we also don't know exactly what that's doing to the relationships between young men and young women, sexually and otherwise, right? There is increasing evidence, especially in countries like Japan and South Korea, although the transformation curves seem to be playing out the same way in the rest of the West, except delayed. There's a tremendously high rate of virginity now in Japan. I think it's something like 30% of Japanese young people, 30 and under, have never had any sexual encounter whatsoever. The relationship scene is fragmenting in those countries. The birth rate has absolutely plummeted. And we have no idea what the connection is between that and the very straightforward and simple sexual gratification that's available online. We also have no idea how it is that young people's sexual preferences are trained as a consequence of their exposure to online pornography. And so is it cataclysmic? Probably. It's an insanely powerful technology. And I've been thinking about this too, is that we misapprehend what's happening because it's easy to think that the women on Pornhub, for example, who are participating, the men as well, are just women, but they're not women in a way. They're women-machine hybrids because no woman can be in a million rooms at the same time. And you can think about that also with regard to sites like OnlyFans, is the women have been transformed into images that can be propagated everywhere. And that's a insane technological revolution. And it's also very possible for young women to monetize their beauty, right? And tempting for them to do that because, well, a small proportion of them can make a very large amount of money and in a manner that appears easy and also that draws a lot of attention. And so if you have a narcissistic tilt or if you've been isolated and are lonely and need attention, then that's a hell of a way to get it.